Jack and Mike had a tradition. Every Thursday night, the two friends would meet up to explore remote roads, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was a way to escape the routine, feel the adrenaline of speed on their bikes, and at the same time, enjoy the tranquility of the mountainous landscapes. For them, this was the perfect way to end the week. That night, they decided to take a different road, one that few knew about, and that, according to rumors, was surrounded by local legends. The road was narrow, lined with tall trees, and enveloped in an almost palpable silence. The darkness seemed denser than usual, and a thin mist covered the path ahead. Jack, the more cautious of the two, noticed something strange in the air but said nothing, preferring not to spoil the fun. As they progressed, the silence between them was comfortable, as it always was on Thursday nights. But something about this road made them both feel a slight unease. It was as if they were being watched, though there was no one around. When they reached a bend, Jack saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A female figure, dressed in white, was standing on the roadside. She was extremely pale, almost translucent in the headlights' glow. Jack blinked, and the woman disappeared as quickly as she had appeared. "Did you see that?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mike, focused on the road ahead, glanced at him in confusion. "See what?" Mike replied, not slowing down. "A woman. She was there on the road. But she disappeared," Jack explained, still trying to process what he had seen. Mike let out a short laugh, trying to dispel the tension. It must have been just a shadow, or a reflection of something. We're in the middle of nowhere. It's easy to imagine things. Jack wanted to believe that, but something inside him told him he had seen more than just a shadow. He kept the thought to himself, deciding not to let a fleeting vision ruin the night. However, the feeling that something was wrong stayed with him as they continued down the road. That was only the first of many strange occurrences they would experience that night. As Jack and Mike continued down the road, the discomfort that had been just a slight unease began to intensify. Time seemed to be passing strangely, and the feeling that they were taking longer than usual to reach their destination started to worry Jack. He checked his watch, trying to understand why the journey, which should have been quick, now seemed endless. Mike, on the other hand, was focused on maintaining the pace, but even he couldn't help but notice that something was off. The road's curves, which should have been familiar, now seemed to repeat themselves, as if they were going in circles. The sense of déjà vu was inescapable, and the silence, which had once been comfortable, began to feel heavy. "This doesn't make sense," Mike murmured, breaking the silence. "We should have reached the next town at least half an hour ago." Jack agreed, but didn't have an answer that made sense. Everything seemed to be against them. The fog, which had been thin earlier, was now denser, making it harder to see. And although they tried to stay calm, the idea that they might be lost in a place where time and space didn't make sense started to emerge. Finally, Jack decided it was time to say something. "We need to stop and figure out what's going on," he said, motioning for Mike to slow down. Mike nodded and eased off the throttle, pulling over to the side of the road. The place where they stopped was even stranger. There were no sounds of insects or wind. It was as if the world around them had frozen. They both dismounted their bikes and looked around, trying to find some explanation. The road was empty, with no signs of life, and the trees around them seemed to form an impenetrable wall. The feeling that something was wrong was now impossible to ignore. Mike finally broke the silence again. "I think we should try to go back. This road, something is wrong with it." Jack agreed without hesitation. The idea of continuing forward, not knowing what else they might encounter, was too frightening. They got back on their bikes, ready to return. However, when they turned the bikes around, they noticed something even more disturbing. The road that should have taken them back now seemed different. The curves and landscapes they had passed before were no longer there. Instead, the road looked new, as if they had never been on it. Mike and Jack exchanged a worried glance. What had been just an uncomfortable feeling now turned into a palpable fear. They were trapped in a place that didn't make sense, and it increasingly seemed that the only option was to keep going, even without knowing where the road would lead them. Jack and Mike decided to keep going. Turning back no longer seemed like a viable option, and the road ahead, as strange as it was the only available route. The tension between the two was growing, and the silence that had once been natural now became almost unbearable. As they advanced, Jack noticed something in the middle of the fog. The same female figure he had seen earlier was there again, standing on the roadside. She was closer this time, and unlike the first appearance, Mike saw her too. The woman seemed even paler under the headlights. Her empty eyes stared at the road ahead, and her white dress contrasted with the darkness around her. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Mike, who had always been the more skeptical, was now visibly uncomfortable. "Did you see that?" Jack asked, not taking his eyes off the woman. "Yes, I saw," Mike replied, his voice lower than usual. "What is she doing here?" Neither of them had an answer. As they passed the figure, she disappeared as suddenly as the first time. There was no movement, just the disappearance, as if she had never been there. Jack and Mike remained silent, processing what they had just witnessed. The road, already disturbing, now seemed more threatening than ever. They continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The road seemed even more endless, and the feeling of being trapped in a never-ending cycle was oppressive. Every kilometer increased the tension, and they both knew that something very strange was happening, but they didn't dare speak it out loud. The road, which had once been just a mysterious path, now became a labyrinth of anxiety and fear. They were no longer just trying to reach a destination. They were struggling to escape something that seemed beyond their comprehension. The woman's figure didn't reappear, but her absence was almost as disturbing as her presence. Jack and Mike knew she was out there somewhere, waiting, watching. The feeling of being observed was constant, and with every turn, the expectation of seeing her again kept them on high alert. The friends pressed on, but the cloud of uncertainty enveloped them like the fog covering the road. Each passing kilometer brought more questions than answers, and the only certainty they had was that this night would not end like the others. The road seemed endless. Jack and Mike, usually confident in their nocturnal adventures, were now overwhelmed by uncertainty. The woman's apparition had left them both on high alert, and every meter they traveled only reinforced the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The silence between the two friends became heavy, almost suffocating. Neither wanted to admit it out loud, but the reality was that they were starting to feel lost on a road that seemed to have no end. Mike kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, trying to maintain control, while Jack couldn't stop looking to the sides, expecting to see the woman's figure reappear. "We need to find a way out," Jack said, breaking the silence, his voice full of urgency. "I know, but where?" Mike replied without taking his eyes off the road. The road, which had once seemed just unfamiliar, now felt hostile, as if it were trying to keep them trapped. Every curve was a repetition of the last, and every kilometer they traveled didn't bring them closer to a destination, but rather pushed them further away from safety. The sense of déjà vu increased with each turn. The trees, the fog, even the occasional streetlights, everything seemed repetitive, as if they were driving in circles. Mike was beginning to lose confidence in his navigation skills, something that had never happened before. "This doesn't make sense," Jack murmured, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of change. The clock on the bike's dashboard showed that hours had passed, but it seemed like time was moving strangely, almost as if it was slowing down. Jack knew that something was manipulating their perception, but what? Finally, Mike decided to try something different. He slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, turning off the headlights. Darkness enveloped them completely, and for a moment, everything was utterly silent. The only sound was their own breathing, quick and shallow. "We need to think," Mike said, trying to stay calm. "Let's go back to basics. Straight road. Keep moving forward. There's no way we can get lost like this." Jack agreed, but the doubt remained. They had already tried moving forward before, and all they got was more road, more fog, and a growing sense of dread. Still, with no other options, they started their bikes again and decided to continue. As they accelerated back onto the road, something changed. It wasn't a visible change, but a sensation, as if they were being pushed onto a predetermined path. The discomfort was turning into fear, and the road, which had once been a route to freedom, now felt like a carefully laid trap. Jack and Mike pressed on, not knowing if they were getting closer to an exit or if they were delving even deeper into something unknown and terrifying. The road held them, and the feeling that they were at the mercy of forces beyond their control intensified with every meter. Jack and Mike's discomfort had turned into a silent fear. They continued down the road, but now with a growing awareness that something was very wrong. The feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle was becoming more and more real, and the road seemed to be toying with their minds, repeating in strange and disconcerting patterns. Suddenly, the woman's figure appeared again, this time closer than ever. Jack saw her first, but Mike soon noticed her too. She was there, standing by the side of the road, with the same white dress, the same empty eyes, and a presence that seemed to drain the warmth from the night. This time, the apparition lasted longer. The woman stood there, motionless, as the two friends passed her, without making any movement. It was as if she was watching, waiting. Jack felt his heart race, and Mike held his breath, both aware that something was not right. "Did you see how close she was?" Jack asked, his voice tense. "Yes." She was clearer this time, more real, Mike replied, trying to stay calm. The woman disappeared just as before, vanishing into the darkness without a trace. But the impact of her presence lingered with them. The road, which had already been unsettling, now felt like a labyrinth with no exit, and every kilometer they traveled increased the fear that they were getting further and further away from any hope of escape. The two friends continued the journey, but now with the certainty that they were not alone. The road wasn't just a path, it was a trap, one that kept them prisoners in an endless cycle. The woman's apparition was a constant reminder that something was watching them, something that knew their deepest fears. Jack and Mike knew they had to keep going, but each time the woman's figure appeared, the terror they felt grew. The road stretched out ahead of them, an apparently endless path that forced them to confront not just the fear of the unknown, but also the uncertainty of being trapped in a situation that defied all logic. With each turn, the expectation of seeing her again kept them on high alert. They didn't know when or where the figure would reappear, but they knew she was there, waiting for them, watching. And the road, once a symbol of freedom, was now a never-ending nightmare that pushed them further into the unknown. As Jack and Mike continued down the road, the tension between them only grew. Every kilometer seemed to prolong the silent terror that now enveloped them both. The woman's figure hadn't reappeared since the last time, but her absence was as disturbing as her presence. They remained on edge, expecting her to show up again at any moment. Suddenly, something even stranger happened. The fog that had covered the road began to dissipate, revealing a clearing ahead. As they got closer, they realized that the road simply ended. There were no signs, no turns, just an abrupt stop, as if the path had been cut by an invisible knife. Mike was the first to stop his bike, with Jack right behind him. They dismounted and walked to the point where the road ended. Before them, what should have been the continuation of the road turned into a total void, a space where nothing existed. It was as if the world had unraveled there, leaving them on the edge of an unknown abyss. This doesn't make sense," Mike said, his voice filled with disbelief. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to process what he was seeing. Jack, equally perplexed, looked around, searching for some explanation. But all he could see was that void ahead, and the still trees around them, as if time had stopped. As they tried to understand what was happening, something even more disturbing occurred. When Mike looked back to check the path they had traveled, he realized that the road they had come on had disappeared. There was no sign of the path that had brought them here. The clearing was completely surrounded by trees, with no clue as to where they had come from. "We're not in the same place anymore," Jack murmured, the realization finally hitting him. "But how is that possible?" Mike replied, his tone revealing the panic that was starting to take hold. The clearing they were in now seemed like a separate space, isolated from everything. There was no sound, no wind, or any other sign of life. It was as if they had been transported to a different dimension, a place where the laws of physics and logic didn't apply. The idea that they were trapped in a place outside of reality began to solidify in their minds. Jack and Mike exchanged a look filled with fear and uncertainty. Not knowing what else to do, they decided to explore the area around them, hoping to find some way out, some sign that would help them escape this surreal prison. But as they walked through the clearing, an oppressive sense of despair began to overwhelm them. There was no sign of the road, no sign of the woman, just that incomprehensible void ahead and the trees that seemed to close in around them. The reality they knew was disintegrating, and the clearing where they now stood was becoming a physical representation of their growing fear. Realizing that there was no apparent way out, the only thing left was to face the unknown ahead. Jack and Mike knew that the night was far from over and that the worst was yet to come. Despair was beginning to take hold of Jack and Mike. The clearing, where the road had once been, was now just an empty space surrounded by impenetrable trees. The absolute silence that enveloped them heightened the feeling of isolation. Reality seemed to have fragmented around them, leaving them trapped in an invisible prison. "We need to find a way out," Jack said, trying to stay calm. But inside, he could feel the anxiety growing. "But where to?" Mike replied, his voice laden with frustration. "There's no road anymore. There's nothing left." They walked around the clearing, trying to find some clue as to how they had ended up there. But everything around them seemed static, as if time had stopped. No leaves moved, no sound disturbed the air. It was as if they were inside a frozen painting, unable to escape. After some time, Jack noticed something strange. Although they were walking in a straight line, they didn't seem to be making any progress. The trees around them remained the same, and the clearing seemed to stretch infinitely, as if they were trapped in a loop. "We're walking in circles," Jack murmured, feeling a chill run down his spine. Mike stopped, looking around with wide eyes. He had noticed it too. It was as if the very space was keeping them trapped, denying any progress. "This can't be happening," Mike whispered, his voice almost inaudible. Suddenly, they both froze as they heard a sound. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but clearly coming from somewhere in the clearing. A faint echo of footsteps, as if someone was moving in the distance. They exchanged nervous glances, knowing they were not alone. "Did you hear that?" Jack asked, trying to identify the source of the sound. "Yes," Mike replied, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "Someone's out there." The sound of the footsteps continued, slowly approaching. The fear they felt intensified with each passing second. They didn't know who or what was coming, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger. The fear of the unknown began to dominate their minds. They wanted to run, to flee from that strange clearing, but there was nowhere to go. The sound of the footsteps continued, drawing closer and closer until it finally stopped. A deathly silence fell over the place. Jack and Mike stood still, holding their breath, waiting for the next move. But nothing happened. The silence returned, but now it was more oppressive, as if something was waiting just out of sight. With no alternatives, they decided to wait. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely, and the darkness around them seemed thicker, heavier. The night dragged on, and the clearing became more and more suffocating. The idea that they were being hunted, that something invisible was pursuing them, began to take shape in their minds. They were trapped in a place where logic and reality didn't apply, and the only certainty was that the night still held many dark secrets. The darkness around Jack and Mike grew increasingly oppressive. The silence, once merely uncomfortable, now felt like a weight on their shoulders, almost suffocating. Every passing second in the clearing heightened the sense that they were trapped in a place where logic and time no longer existed. Not knowing where to go, the two friends remained where they were, trying to stay calm. But the fear, once a silent presence, was now transforming into terror. The sensation that something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to act, grew stronger by the minute. Jack was about to suggest that they try moving forward again, when a sound broke the silence. A soft rustling, almost as if someone or something was moving among the trees around them. Both turned towards the sound, their eyes fixed on the darkness, trying to identify what was causing the noise. Suddenly, the figure of the woman appeared again. This time, she was standing in the middle of the clearing, just a short distance from the two friends. Her white dress seemed even paler against the dark background, and her empty eyes were fixed on Jack and Mike. "My God," Mike whispered, feeling the terror rising inside him. The woman didn't move, but her presence was overwhelming. Jack tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He was paralyzed, unable to look away from the spectral figure. Then, without warning, the woman began to walk toward them. Her movements were slow, almost graceful, but each step seemed to echo in Jack and Mike's minds. The fear they felt reached a new level, something primal and uncontrollable. Jack took a step back, instinctively trying to move away, but his feet felt glued to the ground. Mike was in the same situation, fighting the urge to run, but unable to move. The woman's figure continued to approach, her eyes locked on them, as if she were absorbing all the fear emanating from the two friends. When the woman was just a few meters away, she stopped. For a moment, everything was completely still. Jack and Mike held their breath, waiting for the next move. Then, without warning, the woman raised her hand and pointed at them, as if marking them in some way. The panic finally broke the spell that had kept them paralyzed. Jack took a step back, stumbling, while Mike finally managed to move, pulling Jack with him. Without thinking, they started running in the opposite direction, trying to escape from the figure that seemed to control that distorted reality. As they ran, the sound of the woman's footsteps echoed behind them, but she didn't seem to be getting closer. It was as if she was chasing them, but at the same time, letting them escape, like a cat playing with a mouse. Jack and Mike ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like they would give out. But the clearing stretched on endlessly, and the feeling of being hunted didn't leave them. Finally, exhausted, they stopped to catch their breath, realizing that the woman's figure had disappeared again. The fear persisted, and the clearing, once a place of confusion, had now become a true nightmare. The night seemed endless, and the woman's presence, even when invisible, was palpable. They knew that this wasn't over, that the road, the clearing, and the night itself had much more to reveal. After the intense escape, Jack and Mike were exhausted, but the fear hadn't left them. The clearing, which seemed endless, continued to stretch around them with the same oppressive silence. The woman had disappeared again, but the sensation of her presence continued to hang over them. Sitting on the ground, panting, they tried to gather their strength and think of a strategy. The reality around them seemed distorted, and every attempt to find an exit only deepened their despair. Time was in a state of suspension, and the clearing seemed like a place beyond the reach of logic. Jack, staring into the void, noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the center of the clearing, where the darkness seemed densest, there was a small structure, almost hidden by the mist that still lingered. It looked like some kind of altar or pedestal, covered in leaves and dirt. "Look at that," Jack said, pointing to the structure. Mike followed Jack's gaze, and although he was still terrified, curiosity began to overcome fear. They stood up and walked over to the structure, trying to ignore the chill running down their spines at the sight of the altar. The structure appeared to be a stone pedestal with strange inscriptions around it. The markings were worn and almost illegible, but there was something unusual about the way they were arranged. Jack examined it more closely while Mike kept watch, his mind still alert for any sign of danger. "These inscriptions, they look ancient," Jack commented, trying to decipher the symbols. "But what does it mean?" Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the clearing, and the mist seemed to thicken, covering the structure in a denser layer. Jack and Mike exchanged nervous glances. The feeling of being watched returned with full force. As they looked at the altar, a strange sense of déjà vu began to set in. Jack started to recall earlier moments, the times they had felt a presence, as if the structure was somehow connected to the woman and the road. "It could be some kind of energy point or something," Jack suggested, his voice trembling. Mike shook his head, still struggling to understand. Then, suddenly, the pedestal began to glow with a faint light, emitting a soft aura that illuminated the clearing. The inscriptions began to stand out, and the figures became clearer, as if the pedestal was communicating in some way. The glow intensified, and in an instant, the clearing was filled with a vision that neither could have imagined. The trees and mist disappeared, and the clearing transformed into a deep, dark abyss. The pedestal now stood at the center of a bottomless chasm, and the feeling of being in a place outside of time became overwhelming. The abyss seemed to engulf the entire clearing, and Jack and Mike felt a growing panic. The pedestal, now the only point of reference, seemed like the only anchor in an absolute void. The sensation of being pulled into the abyss was almost physical, and the fear of being consumed by that void was paralyzing. At the most intense moment of terror, the figure of the woman reappeared at the edge of the abyss. Her empty gaze seemed to pierce into the very souls of Jack and Mike. She was closer than ever before, and the feeling that they were facing something that defied all human comprehension was overwhelming. "We need to get out of here," Jack shouted, trying to grab Mike and pull him away from the pedestal. With desperate effort, Jack and Mike backed away from the pedestal and began running again. The abyss continued to expand behind them, and the sensation of being pulled into the darkness grew with every step. Their desperate flight took them back to the clearing, where reality seemed to be disintegrating again. They needed to find a way out, and the pedestal, now a distant vision, seemed to hold the key to understanding what was happening. Jack and Mike were determined to escape, but the journey was far from over. The clearing continued to transform, and the woman's presence seemed stronger than ever. The abyss was not just a vision. It was a symbol of the terror that enveloped them, and the unknown they still had to face. Jack and Mike's run through the clearing seemed endless, the sensation of panic assaulting every step they took. The abyss ahead of them seemed bottomless, and the pedestal with its strange inscriptions now felt like a distant and almost surreal memory. The woman, with her empty gaze, had vanished, but the feeling of her presence was still oppressive. Finally, after what felt like hours, the clearing began to transform again. The void seemed to be retracting, and the trees and mist started to reappear. The feeling that space was returning to normal brought temporary relief, but Jack and Mike knew they were not yet free. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, his voice tired but determined. "I agree, but we don't know where to go." "The road is gone," Jack replied, trying to stay focused. As they cautiously walked through the clearing, they began to notice a faint glow on the horizon. It was as if a new road was beginning to form, a glimmer of hope amid the chaos. They approached, seeing that the glow emanated from a kind of line cutting across the clearing. With a final effort, Jack and Mike followed the line, which increasingly resembled a real road. As they advanced, the ground around them seemed to stabilize, and the sensation of being in a space outside of time diminished. The mist cleared, and the surroundings became more familiar. The road, now clear and visible, stretched ahead, offering a possible way out. With a sense of relief and exhaustion, Jack and Mike started up their bikes and followed the new road. The feeling of being in control again was comforting, though the tension still lingered. The road stretched on for some time, and the feeling of returning to normalcy was almost palpable. Finally, they spotted lights in the distance, signs of a town or a safe place. The journey had been arduous and terrifying, but the sight of the lights brought a new kind of hope. When they reached the end of the road, they were greeted by the dawn. The daylight brought a sense of security that had been lost during the night. Jack and Mike stopped, exhausted but relieved to finally be out of the clearing and away from the terror they had faced. As they watched the sunrise, they both knew that the experience had marked them forever. The clearing, the abyss, and the woman with her empty gaze were now part of their memories, experiences that defied understanding. But the road that had taken them there had also brought them back to reality. The experience had taught them about fear and resilience, and although the terror of that night could never be completely forgotten, they were finally free, ready to face the world beyond that cursed road. The journey was over, and the return to normalcy was a new beginning, but the feeling that the unknown could still hide in the shadows remained a constant reminder of what they had faced.